All right. It was only 2 weeks ago that Miami was sitting pretty at number 10 in the country, undefeated, and with a 10-point lead against Florida State. Just a couple of weeks later, they're stirring a third consecutive loss, possibly in the ACC, and elimination from the Coastal Division Championship. We bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and FightingGobbler.com to help us break down an interesting Thursday night matchup, one of the better ones we've seen this season, with Virginia Tech hosting Miami. Mike, it's always a good time. Thanks for joining us. I'd love to get your take on the Hokies, which, if we were talking about Virginia Tech's season to date a week ago, there would have been a ton of good stuff to talk about. But then came the shocking loss to Syracuse on the road.
It was a shocking loss, in the fact that Virginia Tech is a much more talented team, top to bottom, than Syracuse. But when you consider Bud Foster's defense over the last few years and the struggles that they've had on that side of the football against true dual threat quarterbacks, I'm not talking about just a running quarterback. They've had their issues there too. But a true dual threat quarterback, you look at Shane Carden at East Carolina a few years back. You look at James Summers of East Carolina just last season. He was now the wide receiver there, didn't throw the ball nearly as well. They played in a monsoon last season. Tech couldn't tackle him. You can go up and down the list. Marshall's had plenty of quarterbacks over the past 5 or 6 years that have given the Hokies trouble. Now Tech didn't play them this year, of course, but they've had plenty of trouble against their quarterbacks in the past that have been dual threat. Virginia Tech had the same issue last Saturday against Eric Dungey of Syracuse. Look, he throws for over 400 yards. He runs for over 100. He's only a sophomore. He's played much better this season than he did last season when he was a true freshman there. For the Orange, I think the offense there that Dino Babers has installed, that quick-hitting, fast-paced, short-passing offense, has really benefited him because he's got the receivers on the outside that can really play. Amba Editawo, obviously you look at Herb Phillips, who made a couple big plays in the passing game there for Syracuse, especially early on. The Hokies have just really struggled because they play man across the board. They like to blitz guys from the secondary and from the linebacking core. They like to send 5 or 6 different guys at once on a given blitz play there for Bud Foster's defense. And it's hard to do that when you have a quarterback that's getting the ball out of his hands really quickly and athletic playmakers on the outside that can beat your cornerbacks. And that's the problem that Virginia Tech had again last Saturday. But I think the more surprising thing about the Hokies last weekend was the fact that when you look at their offense, they're facing off against one of the worst worst defenses in the country in Syracuse in terms of total defense. Syracuse entered the matchup with the Hokies ranked outside of the top 115. That's how bad that they were on the defensive side of the football heading into last Saturday's game. The Hokies were only able to muster up 17 points. Top to bottom, it was the worst game that Gerard Evans has played at quarterback for the Hokies from not only a decision-making standpoint, but the fact that he was turning the football over as well, even when he was, even when he wasn't making the right decisions. He was throwing into coverage and still making some questionable calls, even in the running game on the option read. So not a great game for Gerard Evans. And the stats don't necessarily reflect it, given his final stats. Still threw for a couple hundred yards in that one and kept the Hokies in it. But given the issues that they had on the defensive side of the ball, Evans needs to be much better here entering Thursday night, and I think he will against this Miami defense.
Yeah, let's get back to Bud Foster in just a second against Brad Kaya and company, but we'll stay with the Virginia Tech offense. Gerard Evans, like you say, if you look at last game, statistically not bad. If you look at the entirety of the season, 17 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions. Trayvon McMillan, not necessarily carving things up in the rushing game recently. Just your thoughts about the Hokies' performance on offense in recent weeks and how it possibly stacks up against a brittle Miami defense that's very talented but missing some key contributors this week.
Yeah, coming into this game, the Hurricanes' entire defensive line is injured at this point. You're talking about 2 defensive ends and a defensive tackle potentially missing the matchup on Thursday night. It's all the more paramount for the Hokies to get the ball rolling in the running game, and they really haven't been able to run the ball that well in recent weeks, and it's been the Achilles heel. And look, Justin Fuente said before the season, he said, you throw the ball to score, but you run the ball to win. In the last few weeks, Virginia Tech hasn't really run the ball that well, and they became one-dimensional against Syracuse, threw the ball a little bit too much. The Orange were able to make some plays, get some pressure on the Hokies offensive line and Evans as a quarterback, and that really contributed to Hokies struggling on offense. And look, they need to run the ball better. I think Trayvon McMillan is a huge reason why they had balance towards the end of last season, were able to complete more passes in the passing game with Michael Brewer and Brendan Motley, whoever it may have been there at the position last season. And you have more athleticism at the quarterback position this year than you've had in recent years. And I think the way to take advantage of it is to set him up not only with his running ability, but with Trayvon McMillan's running ability as well. They've run the ball with Marshawn Williams at times too. They just need to be better up front, blocking for the run, and the running backs need to find some holes because, look, if they don't do that and they become one-dimensional against this Miami team, no matter who they stack up there in the front seven, the Hurricanes can have their way there Thursday night in Blacksburg. It won't be a pretty sight if the Hokies become one-dimensional once again.
Yeah, the Canes feeling pretty good about its front seven coming into the season. They had some issues in the secondary coming back from 2015 and losing a number of players. But Demetrius Jackson, 5.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks.
He's out.
He's out. Yeah. Scott Patchen's out. 5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Chad Thomas is questionable at this point. He's got 3.5 sacks and 8 tackles for loss. Defensive tackle Gerald Willis looks like he's going to be out for this game. They are really beat up front. Talking about the Miami defensive front against Virginia Tech. So you would think Trayvon McMillan, and I'm looking at the stat line right now, has really only had one game, and that was the Tennessee game. That is the type of productivity that we expected coming off a huge freshman campaign.
I was going to say, and when you consider the Tennessee game, that's really mostly off of one run. He had that 169-yard touchdown run that he had there in the first quarter. But besides that, McMillan was relatively quiet. But even then, that was his best game of the year to date, and they really committed to the run in that game. You're wondering if Justin Fuente tries to establish the run a little bit more on Thursday night against the Hurricanes because, look, I think Gerard Evans is more than capable of producing in the passing game. I think it would make life a little bit easier on him if the team wasn't so one-dimensional on offense. And I think that Thursday night you might see a little bit more of a commitment to the run, much like they did 2 weeks ago against North Carolina, albeit because they had to in Hurricane Matthew.
You know, Brad Keyes had a decent season. We expected more of a breakout from him this year, obviously with Mark Richt wanting to run a more traditional offense and really establish a running game. The numbers for Kaya aren't going to be glossy. They've had issues pass blocking as they have in recent years. I know they've only given up 7 sacks, but that's a misleading total. He's been under pressure most of the season, 10 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. And again, getting back to Mark Richt, and the two of us, we talked about it all off season. What Mark Richt loves to do on offense is play action pass off a strong running game. Well, they looked great against 3 inferior foes, had the #1 rushing offense in college football. Well, that was extremely misleading. Mark Walton the last 3 weeks, Mike, 3.4, 2.9, and 2.8 yards per carry. He's their leading rusher. They've only gained 39 in the rushing game against Georgia Tech, 44 against Florida State. A little more productive last week against North Carolina, but still against a average Tar Heels defense, just the running game has been non-existent.
Yeah, and when you consider even last weekend against North Carolina, we talked about them struggling against the run, but by the time they established the run in that game for the Hurricanes, they were already 2 touchdowns down against North Carolina. They were late in the third quarter when Mark Walton had his touchdown run. So the Hurricanes really need to run the football. We're talking about the Hokies needing to run the ball. Miami really needs to run the ball well in this game because when you look at Virginia Tech, you know, we talk about them struggling against a mobile quarterback. Well, they're not facing that this week against Brad Kaya, so they can sit back in the passing game and rely on their corners and their safeties the way they've played for most of this season to get the job done for them. And their lives on the defensive side of the ball are going to be made all the more easier if Miami's unable to run the football again, like they've struggled to do in recent weeks. They got to get Mark Walton and Joe Yearby going from a Hurricanes perspective if they want to have any chance in this game, in my opinion, because Brad Kaya, I mean, he had an opportunity last weekend against North Carolina to lead the team down the field, wasn't able to do it. There are some question marks despite all of the measurables, and Brad Kaya, in my opinion, being I think he's a great quarterback. He's got the arm, he's got the size, he's got all that going for him. But if you don't have the running game, you put all the pressure on him. He's proven here the last few times out where his back's been against a wall, he hasn't necessarily been able to get the job done. Of course, the Florida State game is the one aberration in that. Of course, he was able to lead the team down the field with 2 minutes left. And then, of course, the kick gets blocked, and they end up losing that game in a heartbreaker. But Brad Kaya has been a little bit shaky in late-game situations. Hurricanes fans comment on it all the time, essentially, and I think that his life will be made a little bit more easier if they're able to run the football with Mark Walton and Joe Yearby here in Blacksburg on Thursday night.
Yeah, it goes to show you how things change quickly in college football. As I mentioned off the top just a couple weeks ago, you're sitting at number 10 in the country. You're undefeated. You're up on your arch rival Florida State, and this is not vintage Florida State, but still extremely talented top 15 team, and you're up by 10 points. You're looking great. And 2 weeks later, you're staring at possibly 3 consecutive losses with a difficult trip to Blacksburg and taking on Virginia Tech. Stacey Coley's been banged up the last few weeks. He had a nice game against Florida State with 7 receptions and 2 touchdowns, had 5 TDs in 3 games, but then he was bottled up against North Carolina, 2 catches for 12 yards and hurt his knee. So he's in rough shape as well. So any feel on this one at Lane Stadium on Thursday night, Mike?
Yeah, some will see this as a homer pick, A, because I'm a Virginia Tech grad, B, because I now write about the Hokies as well on the side. But looking at Virginia Tech in this game, I think that they've had a pulse on this game for quite some time. I think that's a lot of the reason why they lost that game against Syracuse last Saturday. I think it was a trap game, a look-ahead game, and I think that it lived up to the hype as that when seeing how they played and the product on the field. I think Virginia Tech will absolutely be ready for Miami on Thursday night. They're a 6-point favorite in this one, and when looking at Virginia Tech here the night before on Wednesday night being a 6-point favorite, the big question mark, of course, is will Kenneth Cannon play on the defensive line for Virginia Tech? He's listed as questionable with an upper extremity injury. What that is at this point, we're unsure. There have been some murmurs it's a shoulder injury. I mean, if that's the case and they're able to wrap it up and he's able to go and be even 80 to 90% of himself, I think that would be a huge help, especially if Miami's able to establish a run game early. It's going to be huge to have Kenneth Cannon in there at the defensive end, not only to stop the run, but get pressure on Brad Kayak, because God knows they're going to need it on Thursday night. But I like the Hokies in this game to win and cover the spread. I mean, I think they're a couple touchdowns better than Miami right now. Both teams are sliding. Virginia Tech has shown that after a loss against Tennessee, they were able to bounce right back and get a huge win the following week against Boston College, albeit it was Boston College and not this Miami team who's much more talented here coming into Blacksburg on Thursday night. But I like Virginia Tech to win, and we've seen Miami lose, and they've been unable to stop that slide. This will tell us a lot about Miami if they're able to go into Blacksburg and knock off the Hokies on Thursday. It'll say a lot to the resiliency of Mark Richt's team, but I like Virginia Tech to win this game on Thursday.
All right. Anytime Miami and Virginia Tech mentioned in the same sentence, it brings back memories of matchups between top 10 Titans in the Big East and later to a certain extent in the ACC. But right now, it's probably an elimination game, especially for Miami, for a Coastal Division championship, but should be a good one on Thursday night. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also from fightinggobbler.com helping us sort out, as usual, Miami and Virginia Tech. Thanks a lot, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Mark.